welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra. I'm Hayley Channer, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth US Asia Centre. Today we're speaking with Jennifer Jackett. We are so lucky to have Jennifer on the podcast because she's had a very diverse career working for government. She's most recently worked for the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. She's also worked for the Department of Defence and Office of National Intelligence. Most recently, though, Jennifer has been awarded the prestigious Sir Roland Wilson Scholarship, allowing her to study a PhD for 3 years. And I'm delighted to say she joins me now. Jennifer, welcome.
Thanks so much, Hayley. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you've had an incredible background working for government. Tell us how you got to where you are now.
Thank you. That's a big question. I first started out, at Sydney University studying international relations, human geography and languages, and fell in love with learning about the world and speaking to people of all different backgrounds and cultures. So I knew working in a foreign policy related area was something that I wanted to do in the future. So when I finished my degree, I applied for a lot of different graduate programs in Canberra, as many people do, and was fortunate to have the opportunity to work for the Department of Defence. So that's where I started out my public service career and had the chance to work in a range of areas, including defence capability development and international policy. After a few years there, though, I thought I really wanted to get a broader understanding of how government works, and where better to do that than going to the heart of government in Prime Minister and Cabinet. So I applied for a role there and started out working in the Cabinet division, supporting Cabinet coordination and governance, and then went on to have policy roles in counter-terrorism and also critical infrastructure and counter-foreign interference. I also had the chance to go work up at Parliament House for a Cabinet Secretary, which was amazing to see the direct intersection of politics and policy day to day.
Gosh, it feels like you have lived a lifetime already being in government and up at Parliament House and doing so many different topics. So now you are using some of that experience and also your interest and passion for critical technologies to undertake this PhD. What drove you to select critical technologies as the PhD that you would undertake, and what kind of issues are you grappling with in it?
I guess, first of all, I knew that I wanted to build my subject matter expertise on a particular topic that would be of significance for Australia's future and also what happens internationally. And over the last couple of years working on critical infrastructure issues, I did have the chance to get a better sense of what critical technologies actually mean and why it matters for Australia. It's a very complex policy area. There are many different policy levers that impact what happens with critical technologies. Also, what's critical today might be different to what's critical 10 years from now. And so I thought there's enough in this subject area that I really wanted to get a better understanding of it, what it means not only for Australia and our role in this set of issues, but also what it means for US-China strategic competition, which will be the most consequential relationship, I think, for the next number of decades and century ahead.
So when I hear critical technologies, I feel a bit confused because it's not something I feel I can engage with easily. So if I look back in the past, say the past 10 to 15 years in international and strategic affairs, I would think some of the areas that have popped up that have been areas for people to research and look into have been counter-terrorism, the new cyber realm, also foreign interference and foreign ownership. Now there's this thing called critical technology. What is critical technology? What makes technologies critical, some and some not critical? And then is there also a space in the middle where there's sometimes both?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, at its simplest level, critical technologies are those things that matter for our national interest. And that might be for our economic prosperity, that might be for our national security, or it might be for our social well-being. And what's critical today might be different to what was critical 10 years ago. But to give you an example of the types of things that can impact different aspects of our national interest today, they'd be areas like artificial intelligence and different applications, whether that's in our banking and financial sector, or whether it's in our transport sector. It might be things like quantum computing and cryptography, which can help with our secure communications. Or it might be things like 5G telecommunications technologies, which can support the immense processing of data in a very quick period of time and enable the application of a huge range of technologies across our economy. So there really are a wide range of things that might be critical, but often it's just a particular application that makes it more important than another. So if it relates to the operation of a critical infrastructure system, like energy and power, for example, perhaps that makes it more critical than if it was used in a sort of day-to-day activity that didn't have a broader consequence.
So some people might be wondering, I work for the Perth US Asia Centre. Our remit is the Indo-Pacific and the relationships and countries in our region. Why am I talking to you about critical technology? Jennifer, tell us why critical technology matters to our region. What is the future for countries in our region that have new critical technology? And what's the relationship with those countries and Australia? Are there links? And what should we be knowing about what's happening in this space?
Yeah, I think there's a few parts to that question.
it was about 4 questions in one.
I think the first point to make is that critical technologies have really gained prominence and attention today because they're a central tenet of great power competition between the US and China. And we've seen that in a lot of public statements from both President Xi and President Biden in recent times, but also other countries across the globe starting to pay increased attention to what technologies they manufacture, what they have access to, and who has what. And the reason that does matter in a great power context is because critical technologies are the fundamental enablers for most aspects of national power, whether you're talking about economic productivity and growth or whether you're talking about the development of sophisticated military capabilities. All of those technologies have what's called generally a dual use potential. That is, they have a civilian application and they have a potential military application. So in the context of US and China, what we've seen is that for the last 70 years or so, the US has really led the world as a technological power and technological leader, along with a lot of other Western nations. In the last 10 years or so, China has really emerged as a much more capable technological actor. They spent decades investing in modernising their innovation ecosystems, and they're really using advanced technologies to support their economic growth and prosperity. And that's also enabling other aspects of national power to increase, like their military modernisation programs. So we're seeing a bit of a shift in what's happening internationally in the balance of power in relation to technology, but that also has a broader consequence for great power competition. So I think that's probably the overlay to a lot of the issues that we're seeing today. There are sort of other geopolitical issues which might be important to mention for our region. Take the example of semiconductors and semiconductor supply chains. Now that is a highly strategic technology. Chips or semiconductors are basically critical for everything from our mobile phones through to advanced military platforms. But what we've seen is that as there's increasing demand for really sophisticated technologies today that require the use of chips, there's a lot of pressure on global supply chains. Now, the topography of global supply chains around semiconductors is quite interesting because there's only a handful of countries that are capable of manufacturing this really sophisticated technology. Taiwan actually has the largest market share, I think around 55%. And then Japan, Korea, the US all have a key role to play. China has been investing a lot to try and catch up, but it's still got a way to go. So what we're seeing around...
And China also gets its semiconductors from Taiwan.
That's right. So there's a lot of dependencies in the supply chains and really sort of centralised nodes, I guess, of where these things can be produced. And there's only going to be increasing demand as countries try and integrate these advanced technologies across their economy and into their military capabilities as well. So what happens with the US and China at a strategic level can put pressure on supply chains, but right now, I guess it's stacked in the favour of the US and sort of Western countries, and China is really trying to play catch up. I guess where a lot of this comes to a head is thinking about whether there's an increase in geopolitical competition and even cross-strait tensions right now. It really draws attention to these issues and some of the risks that can come about for things like semiconductor supply chains as a result of other events going on.
Gosh, there really are a lot of issues there to unpack. So what I'm hearing is this is a major issue that cuts across so many different sectors that is related to different national infrastructure and also the relationship between major powers, the US and China. In thinking about the actual security challenges, are you able to give an example or be more specific about, how do you translate what's a critical technology and some of those risks that you identified with an actual hypothetical situation so that people can understand, really relate, okay, this is critical technology, there's a potential pressure point or point of vulnerability over here, this is how we would deal with that.
Yeah, I think sort of to think about it through a more purely national security lens and what the types of risks and issues for that a national government might have to consider, there's a few different angles. So the first one is around data and storage of personal information. So a lot of these technologies, especially things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, rely on huge volumes of data to actually be optimized and operate well. And so there's questions around, for those technologies that draw on large amounts of data, where is that information stored? Who has access to it? Is it vulnerable to disruption or sabotage or espionage even? And how do you protect against that? Keeping in mind that a lot of these technologies are used by private firms or even by individuals. These aren't things that are sort of managed and regulated across the board by government.
And not things that governments can necessarily control or regulate?
Yeah, I think there are efforts sort of at certain levels for the more critical aspects of the economy that are regulated through different bits of legislation. For example, in Australia, we have the Security Critical Infrastructure Act that does play a role in regulating and requiring certain standards for owners and operators of critical infrastructure. So there are a range of sort of policy levers that exist to protect people's privacy and data, but as a general sort of risk area to manage, that's certainly one that requires ongoing vigilance as a lot of new technologies are rolled out. I think sort of relating to that, these technologies provide new vectors for exploitation or misuse, whether that's by state actors or whether by criminal organisations. Now, technologies are sort of evolving and changing every day, and that's why it can be hard sometimes to work out what's critical because there's something new often coming just around the corner. But a lot of these nefarious actors are finding opportunities to use these technologies, whether it's to gain access to people's information, whether it's to try and steal something from them. So there's a vector there that creates kind of additional opportunities for people who might wish to misuse it. I think also we've seen, in the context of social media and technology, the use of those platforms in more of a political context or used by actors to try and sow division or divide. So there's that angle to it as well. And then I think in Australia too, we've done a lot of thinking around the ethical considerations to do with technology and how, if people are using these technologies to automate decision processes, whether that's in a recruitment context or even whether it's in the context of sort of security and military capabilities, what does that actually mean and what kind of guiding principles do we need to integrate these new technologies?
So we've heard a lot about the challenges of critical technology, including the issues around data and also the major power rivalry. These are obviously challenges Australia is going to face, and it doesn't want to face alone. It will need to work with other countries. What partners is Australia working with to resolve this problem?
Yeah, so I think what we've seen is over the past couple of years, particularly since Australia's decision on 5G and a lot of the substantive policy work that's occurred around critical infrastructure risks and management, there's been a lot of international engagement with a range of countries, but particularly countries within the Five Eyes. And I think we're starting to see the emergence of new forums for cooperation and information exchange. So as an example, your listeners would recall that at the Quad earlier this year at the leaders level, they announced the establishment of a emerging technologies working group. And that in part was to help support the development of principles for tech design, development and use, tech standards, and really have a forum where countries could talk about what technology is coming over the horizon through things like foresight capabilities. So that's one example of sort of more substantive avenues for cooperation that Australia will be involved in the Quad context. We are seeing also calls for broader coalitions of like-minded countries, what some people have called techno-democracies. So people have talked about...
They're not talking about techno as in music.
No, although that would be fun. People have talked about, possibly forming a T10 arrangement where you have the G7 plus Australia, South Korea and India. So really that's an alignment based on values. And we are starting to see values be a really central feature of cooperation on technology issues, especially in the President Biden and Prime Minister Suga summit recently. Out of their statement there, they talked a lot about the fact that they were countries that had shared values and interests, and we needed to have sort of liberal democratic values underpinning what was happening around the governance of technology. So there are a range of bilateral, multilateral fora internationally that are dealing with these issues with a lot more sort of prominence, and Australia is involved through a range of forums there.
Sometimes in our career, things happen to us that we don't expect and that can take us by surprise. Have you got a story to share with people that's something that was unusual that happened to you that you can reflect back on?
I'm sure there's quite a few, but I will focus just on one. I do remember, again, when I was working in international policy and defence, I had the opportunity to accompany a command and staff college visit to China, and it was a study tour as part of their studies at the Defence College. Now, we had a range of engagements set up for us over in China with a number of different military units and also think tanks. At one of the military units, we were sort of on one of the breaks from the official discussions, and they'd arranged a ping pong game for us all to be involved in.
It's a cultural delight.
A cultural experience. Now, I was the only civilian in the group, so I was in sort of corporate wear, I guess you could say, a dress and heels, and everyone else was in their more traditional military dress. Anyway, they sort of split us off into teams, and the Chinese military officials identified me as the person that they wanted to play against the head of the whole unit, very, very senior.
How kind of them to choose you.
Exactly. And I think they did mention to me that he was extremely good at ping pong, and I thought, okay, great. I'm not very well prepared for this, and I didn't know this was going to happen. I also had in mind the fact, I'm there on an official visit. I sort of wanted to represent my country well, so, do a good job at the ping pong match, but equally I was quite conscious of, potential sensitivities around beating someone who was so senior in a different cultural context. And so I was having these dilemmas as I was playing. I'm
every shot.
Every shot.
The nation's diplomatic relations with China are hanging on each swing.
Yes. And, I played a lot of tennis growing up, so I felt quite comfortable on the ping pong table. And at one stage, I remember I was ahead, and there were about 100 people watching this game, and a lot of them looked quite fearful at what was going to happen if I won. In the end, he beat me, and I think there was a sigh of relief off all of the junior military officers who were there.
Especially the one that said, you need to play the general.
Yes. But it was quite an interesting experience, and just a funny sort of professional thing to have to go through, and all of the geopolitical considerations you have going on with such a sort of seemingly just fun event.
Yes, you can't prepare yourself for things that happen which you're not expecting to happen, and choices that you're not expecting to have to make on that day. But I guess that's what makes people who work in our field so lucky. We have to think on our feet. And thank you so much for spending time talking to us today about your research into critical technologies and sharing with us your background. It's really a credit that you have this scholarship and can do this really valuable research. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Hayley.